All right, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for those of you in different time zones. Welcome to the first web panel hosted by the National Street Outreach Partnership, titled Street Outreach During COVID-19, the Essential Role of Violence Intervention and Virus Interruption. My name is Fernando Rejon, and I am the Executive Director of the Urban Peace Institute in Los Angeles. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. UPI implements violence reduction strategies and advocates for smart justice solutions to end violence and mass incarceration so communities can thrive. Welcome to all our partners, Chicago CRED, also Safe Streets in Chicago, Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, New Life Centers of Chicagoland, the Nonviolence Institute in Providence, Chapter 2, Southern California Crossroads, and Halper Foundation, all in Los Angeles. And our city partners, the LA Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction Needs Development, the City of Chicago Office of Violence Reduction, and the City of Oakland's Department of Violence Prevention. Thank you to our partners, supporters, and colleagues for joining us from cities across the country and internationally. This web panel is scheduled to be 2 hours long. This is our first one, so please bear with us as we may experience some technical difficulties. We ask during the question and response section, you submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to respond to as many as possible. We have over 280 participants who have registered. We invite attendees to shout out their organization or city via the chat function. I want to let you know that we will turn off the chat function at the 15-minute mark. The National Street Outreach Partnership has been years in the making. However, the last 4 years has allowed our groups to come together to focus on building a platform for practitioners to establish a leadership role in our field. We have been building bridges among various street outreach groups and cities across the country over the last decade. We have been to each other's neighborhoods, offices, and homes and have built strong relationships to push the field of violence reduction forward, lifting up the voices of practitioners. Today, we will hear from practitioners and city leaders from 4 different cities. The topic is timely given the crisis we are in. The shooting hasn't stopped in many neighborhoods, and we are experiencing the disproportionate impacts of the coronavirus on communities of color. We are at the nexus of 2 public health crises. These women and men are being asked to increase their risk exposure to reach the hardest to reach populations to address not only violence, but also fill service gaps by providing direct outreach, accurate public health information, PPE, and food directly to the most marginalized communities in the nation, ones that historically have high distrust of government mandates. The role of street outreach and gang intervention is crucial during this time. Cities across the country have classified them as essential workers, and in LA's case, also as emergency personnel to address both public safety and public health during this time. Street outreach needs to be a vital part of the robust public health infrastructure that this country needs. So without further ado, let's hear from our panelists. We'll begin with street outreach practitioners and leaders. And so with that, I would like to introduce the moderator of the first section, a close colleague of mine, Melvyn Hayward from Chicago CRED.
Greetings all. My name is Melvyn Hayward, Head of Programs at Chicago CRED. Our primary focus is to reduce gun violence in a transformative way. Our focus is street outreach, providing life coaching, clinical services, and workforce development. We also provide advocacy for our participants and their families and prevention work with youth in high school. I'm happy to be here today on this momentous occasion to speak on behalf of outreach nationally. Today we have a phenomenal panel. My colleagues who have been doing great work throughout the country, brothers that I've broke bread with and I trust with my life. So at this time, I'd like to introduce my colleagues. I'd like them to briefly introduce themselves and tell the panel a little bit about what their organization does. This time, I'd like to start with Juan Carter.
Good afternoon, Mel. Good to see you. Definitely a pleasure to be here and to see street outreach exposed in this way. And we've been talking about this for a long time, so it's well overdue. I'm Juan Carter. I'm the Director of Street Outreach at the Nonviolence Institute in Providence, Rhode Island. The Nonviolence Institute in Rhode Island has 5 departments that provide services. These services are classified either as intervention or prevention services. The prevention services are nonviolence training, which is also the foundation of the organization in our existence. based on 6 principles and 6 steps of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And then we have our employment services and we have our reentry services. On the intervention side of the Nonviolence Institute, where the focus is today, is comprised of our street intervention team known as the Street Workers. The team is on call 24/7 and is tasked with conducting daily community outreach and violence interruption, along with assisting clients with accomplishing their case plans. The Nonviolence Institute's Victim Services, which is also critical to violence intervention and the intervention strategy at the organization. As we know, there's a victim to perpetrator pipeline, and it's so crucial that we intervene in that pipeline to prevent retaliatory situations. So that's a little bit about the Nonviolence Institute.
Thank you, brother. And thank you for all the work that you do in the beautiful city of Providence. Secondly, I'd like to introduce my colleague, George Matos, phenomenal brother, doing great work in the city of Chicago. George, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about also?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and probably morning to some others right around the country. My name is George Matos. I'm the director of our Safe Streets program at also the Alliance of Local Service Organizations in Chicago on the Northwest Side, predominantly in the Humboldt Park community. And so ALSO's vision is safe homes and safe streets. So we know that there's a connection within the homes and the streets and violence. And so that's one of our key components within our mission. So our mission is is to work in partnership with people living in risk to promote safer homes and safer streets. And again, we know that there's a connection of violence within the homes and the streets, and that's what we really focus on. We have an arm at also where we do some national work around domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and children's exposure to violence as well. And at also, we partner with each other to really understand the intersection of our work and how all of that work and all the things that we do kind of coincide with each other, whether it's violence in the home or violence in the street. So again, I just want to thank everyone for having me on this panel. I'll pass it on.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate your work. Now I'd like to pass it over to Brother Chris Patterson.
Okay, good morning. Can everybody see me? All right, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Patterson from the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago in Chicago. We serve Austin, West Garfield Park, and the back of the yards neighborhoods. We're also part of a larger collaborative called Community Partnering for Peace that serves 22 communities that account for about 85% of the violence in Chicago. We are targeting the group of young men and women in the city, or not necessarily so young, but people who are at risk of either shooting someone or being shot. And we do this through, kinging in nonviolence, principles and steps, restorative justice, hyperlocal, and trauma-informed care. So I'm, excited about, being on the panel and talking a little bit more about all that.
Thank you, Chris. At this time, what I'd like to do is ask the panelists the first question. And I'd like to start off with Juan. Juan, can you answer this? How is street outreach responding to violence and the COVID pandemic at the same time?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Our intervention teams at the Nonviolence Institute have continued to provide services in the state during the pandemic. The street working team is still conducting community outreach to violence-prone hotspots, which often overlap with the COVID-19 hotspots. Street workers are continuing to be on call late into the evenings and early mornings, responding to calls from Rhode Island's only Level 1 Trauma Center, which is via Lifespan, Rhode Island Hospital Emergency Department. We are called by the emergency department for all incidents of community violence. Rhode Island Hospital has been definitely a fantastic partner since our existence. So the access that we have to the hospital is incredible to intervene with victims at a critical moment in their life. They have worked with us to ensure staff safety as much as possible. So just making sure that our staff is kept safe, and making sure that we're going in, we're following protocols, we're going in with masks and gloves, and things like that to keep us safe and also to keep victims safe. Although the function of street workers have not changed because of the public health crisis, they do feel an added sense of responsibility, being even more visible in the community, and are focusing a lot on areas that have high density, such as housing authorities and our housing projects. And we know that being in those, living in housing projects and being on top of each other doesn't allow for much social distancing. We've been able to pass out masks on the street corners and neighborhoods that we outreached in, and we've been also privileged enough to pass out meals to individuals at need in the community as well. And it's continuing to pass on the message and educating folks on the COVID-19, being seen as street outreach workers, across the country, specifically here in Rhode Island, as credible messengers and people that are trustworthy in the community. We want to make sure we continue to pass the messages of social distancing and quarantining and staying at home during this pandemic. Our victim services who begin providing assistance and supports pretty much from the initial incident are working around the clock to support victims of violence in various ways. On a daily basis, victim advocates are helping individuals with housing needs, mental health services, and also victims' compensation, which is very crucial for victims that may have jobs and things like that and may not have benefits and things like that. So both intervention teams have been working around the clock to make sure that that we can provide services to individuals. Even now, even during these times we've had some unfortunate loss of life, and our victim advocates have been out there working with funeral homes and arranging funeral services and things of that nature, even though a lot of people cannot be there during this time and they can't be around their family. So victim advocates play that role as well, providing support services for victims at all times. Staff members have always been a priority. Safety has always been a priority for the staff, and the Nonviolence Institute now even more so during the pandemic. Our intervention team is committed to continuing the work daily, knowing our presence and support services is crucial for high-risk individuals and victims in the neighborhoods where violence is happening. The street workers and victim services work are not exclusive. They are essential to public safety, therefore essential to public health.
Thank you, Juan. Great information. You guys keep up the great work. Next, I'd like to ask Chris Patterson, what essential role does street outreach play during the pandemic in Chicago?
Okay, can you see me? All right. Yeah, thanks, Melvyn, and thank you for that, Juan. So, like a lot of places in the country, we've created the dual roles. So we're not only addressing the conflicts and violence that's happening, we're now public health practitioners, right? Where we have to go out there and educate community members on the safety protocols around COVID-19, which is, in Austin, West Garfield Park in Austin, back at the yards, and in other parts of the country, like it's a real dilemma, breaking up large groups or attempting to do so. So what we've been fortunate enough to be able to do now is anywhere up between 3,000 and 4,000 meals a week we're giving out to families and individuals who are in need of that. Where we're able to, we're passing out masks and helping people just stay safe during this dilemma. The communities of color across the country, particularly in Chicago, are disproportionately affected by this disease. And with violence being what it is, like we're seeing a spike in violence across the city. As many people have probably seen, we're seeing, Memorial Day was a hard weekend for Chicago, as it may have been in other places. So, we're really just trying to, I think, play catch up in a lot of ways as it pertains to the COVID-19. But I would say on the flip side of that coin, because I think a lot of times what we hear is some of the more drastic news that comes out of this dilemma. We've got men and women street outreach professionals who are running towards the fires every day. Like I've seen across the city, the resiliency in the outreach community for those who are just ecstatic about being able to help, prove the profession of outreach as a valuable health model for the communities that we're in. So, it's an exciting time. At the same time, while it's drastic, there's an opportunity for us to really just show our worth. And I think the men and women of outreach across the city, particularly at the Institute for Nonviolence, are stepping up into that role. I think another part that, we'd be remiss without mentioning is just partnerships that are happening across the city because of this. In a lot of ways, because of COVID-19, where we're doing now a morning call across the city with all street outreach workers, including the mayor's office, really strategizing around violence. We're taking it serious. We're doing shooting reviews every single morning in the hopes that, collectively we can come up with an answer that is plaguing our city and cities like Chicago. So right now, I think that's what we're like really entrenched in, like a lot of people are, with the added idea that it's, it's heightened violence because of maybe the stay-at-home order. Maybe people are feeling anxious. People are a lot more easy to identify and find. So there's not a lot of places people can go like in prior times, pre-COVID. People are just standing out on the blocks, right? And so like the dilemma is just really just educating people, getting them to understand the risk that they're taking, the risk that they're exposing their community to. But it's busy. It's a new kind of busy. So again, just fortunate to be able to talk about it and looking forward to the questions and answers.
Thank you, Chris. Next up, I'd like to ask Ben Taco Owens to introduce himself, introduce his agency. And the question that I have for you are, what are the greatest challenges or needs you see in the community?
Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you might be. First of all, thank you for joining this call, for participating. It's always inspiring when you know that people are doing what you're doing across the country. I mean, that's just amazing. The greatest challenges that I think that we're having is having adequate communication as to what are we doing, whether it's from a federal level, a state level, county level, or city level. Our communities don't necessarily understand those boundaries as to, what things should be or how they should be. So I think we're dealing with uncertainty. If this thing is going to, change, which we know that it's not, it's here to stay. We're just dealing with how it's going to impact the work that we do. We are in the summer months here in LA. It's getting hot. A lot of our shootings that initially started over the past 2 months were shot with folks wearing quote unquote coronavirus masks. And I think folks are getting restless. So I think first off, we need to have consistent and parallel information from whether it's the government or whatever rules we're going to follow. And then make sure that we have adequate, equipment to do those jobs, whether it's PPE or just information altogether. So, and communicating that to the community, because not everyone in the community watches the news or, is on social media. So we just need consistent, precise information that the community can understand, and it makes it easier for us to be able to go out and give them the resources that they need.
Thank you, Brother Taco. Appreciate the work you're doing in Los Angeles, brother. Next, I'd like to go to Brother Kentrell Killens, working out of Oakland. with Oakland United. Brother, can you introduce yourself? And can you answer the question about what essential roles does street outreach play during the pandemic in Oakland?
Greetings, Brother Mel, and to the rest of the participants. Thank you for having me a part of this. Yeah, I represent Oakland Unite, Department of Violence Prevention. As a violence prevention liaison, I'll help coordinate a lot of services that are offered in our community through our grantees, specifically around shooting and homicides, violence prevention, working with agencies like Youth Alive for direct shooting and homicide response, KWP, helping the families after there's been, a homicide in our neighborhoods. And also working with relocation, for families who need additional assistance, and things have gotten completely out of control. We have to get families to move to another neighborhood. So there's a high level of coordination going on, information sharing in terms of what's happening in these neighborhoods. In addition to the direct services that are happening around the violence prevention work, there are also other support services that are already in place to support individuals as we, either encounter them through street outreach or through violence interruption. And so we're able to connect folks to life coaches through a number of different agencies who are on the ground maintaining a high level of service with folks, having a connection to the housing component and making sure that, services are wrapped around them because it's, huge needs. And so, but in addition, in response to COVID, we've been able to do some real on the ground work, transforming some of these relationships that we have with our participants and really engaging them in a very thoughtful way. We went to like 9 neighborhoods that are like highest impacted neighborhoods with violence across the city of Oakland. And developing not only relationships with residents and folks there, but then building teams of individuals who are now a part of our COVID response team, as well as doing violence interruption. And so just having on the ground information, as we distributing PPE on a regular basis, in these 9 neighborhoods, we're responding to, the loss of life. Sometimes it's not necessarily violence, but, we also have communities who mourn differently. So we're responding to loss of life, we're responding to shootings and homicides, we're responding to a lot of different things, but we're allowing those who are directly impacted, these neighborhood folks, man, to be take the lead on a lot of what's happening and be real visible within the communities, but also stretch this idea of what credible messengers are. And so they're encountering a lot, man, as we're distributing food, as we're distributing diapers, to communities. We're making sure we're distributing PE on a regular basis. It's a lot of challenges within that work, and so some of the things that are coming up for us as our young people are engaging, as folks are engaging, we got a lot of different populations that we're trying to maneuver through all at one time. And so you can have one community where it's a hot spot with extreme violence in this community, but then you also got a huge population of homeless folks, and so just being able to navigate and share the resources, share the services, and make sure that the community at large is served, man, in a real way, in an effective way. And so it's real groundbreaking work that's actually happening, so I'm excited about hearing all the stuff that's happening across the country and really excited about being a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Brother Kentrell, for all the hard work y'all doing in Oakland, man. I've been there, beautiful city. You got a heck of a team, man. Y'all keep up the great work. Last but certainly not least, this question is for Brother George. What are the greatest challenges and needs you see in the community at this current time, and how are you all dealing with that at also?
Mel, can you repeat that? You went in and out really quick. Repeat the question.
What are the greatest challenges or needs you see in the community, and how are you all dealing with that at Also Safe Streets?
Okay, yeah, so I want to say the greatest challenges we've seen from the beginning is young people and just people in general in the community not really afraid of COVID, right? And not believing that it was gonna hit us the way it has in our communities, right? And so being able to go out there and pound the pavement every single day and put out the messaging and being able to, you know, people in the community hearing it from us versus, you know, hearing it on TV or, you know, on social media, I think has been a huge challenge, right? And so what we've done, and this has been in different stages as well, because in the beginning, there was just so many unknowns and so many things changing rapidly. Every day there was information coming and it was totally different. So we had to be nimble enough, you know, to be able to see the challenges and change as we needed to do every single week. And that was the main piece, was just trying to put that information out in people's hands so they know how to be safe, right? And educating them on what safety looked like, right? And being able to go out there and pass masks. We weren't really ready for this, right? When this pandemic hit, we didn't have supplies. We weren't ready for it. And it took us about a week and a half to get things in, and our partners across the city have helped us across the city, you know, also, and even many other organizations. And once we were able to equip ourselves with masks and gloves and hand sanitizer, you know, and that made the outreach team a lot more safer and more comfortable, we were able to, you know, get in and dig deep into the community where a lot of times no one is really going into, right? Those hotspot areas where we have those open drug markets and places, you know, in the community that a lot of people are just not going and having these fruitful conversations and just letting brothers know, hey, you know, it's about being safe. If you're gonna be out here, man, can you at least put on a mask? Can you do, you know, these essential things to keep yourself safe? So, you know, that was one of the biggest challenges, is getting past that hurdle and getting past all the unknowns. I think we're in a good place right now where not too much information has changed. We know what this virus is, and we know how to, you know, protect ourselves when we're going out. And so it's just constantly reminding ourselves and training staff and being able to push that message out to the community. And it being, the community being that they see us doing it, right? It's not, you know, someone coming from outside of the community or just the news doing it. It's street outreach on the ground, providing that message every single day has been huge.
Thank you for that, Brother George. I know also is on the front line doing phenomenal work, man, and we appreciate your work. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for that great information. Appreciate you all on the front line doing the work, doing God's work, really. And, you know, I just appreciate all of our colleagues across the nation that's on the call. You know, one thing I'd like to mention before I open it up for questions and answers with the group is that here in Chicago, we have kicked off a phenomenal program called the Flip. To our LA colleagues, it's similar to the Ambassador program, where we have over 250 Flip workers, brothers and sisters directly from the community, at the hotspots in the community, working to prevent violence and mediate conflicts as needed. It's a phenomenal piece of work that we're doing in the city of Chicago, and we'll keep you all posted as the work progresses. At this time, I'd like to open up to those participants who are listening for questions and answers. And I think we do have the first question here is from Jonathan Levine. And this is for, I'm gonna ask this question to Chris Patterson. Are any organizations here doing systematic quantitative evaluations of their work? Chris, can you answer that for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So we, Community Partner for Peace, we also have the Chicago Urban Labs working with us through our Ready Chicago program, another initiative that we're a part of. But the Northwestern University is doing an ongoing evaluation of the work, the qualitative work of outreach and how impactful we are on the streets. You know, we've been in this process for the last 2 years, I believe. And so, with some promising results. I do think that, the city of Chicago has acknowledged, the mayor's office here has acknowledged the work that we're doing. Street outreach is, one of the spokes in the wheel to addressing violence in the city.
Thank you, Chris. The second question, let me see here. I will ask this question to Brother Taco. What are the specific challenges addressing street violence during the pandemic? How have you changed your approach?
Well, a few of the things that we've done, being that, we talk about social distancing ourselves. A lot of the work has been done remotely. We're having a little bit more conversations with folks, whether it's over the phone or however we need to communicate with them, in a little bit more detail. So we get quite a few calls for group fights. These fights usually take place in the neighborhood, on the street, since the parks are closed and people don't really have too many places to go. That tells us, or we define that as in-house. So our outreach initially starts with if it's in a community that we service, or if it's in a community that we have relationships with, we start making the calls. We're making the calls as we're en route, because we know that if we're going to a place where there's been violence, for persons taken to the hospital, we can't go to the hospital. If there's a crowd of people, we know the social distancing, we have to have the protective gear on. So we're making more calls than we would normally do, just to have that line of communication for clarity and more detailed as to, what we're going into.
Thank you, brother. So we are starting to receive questions. For those of you who want to ask questions, you can go to your question and answer box here, and we'll definitely get to them. The second question is from Anika Erickson Pearson. And this is for Juan. Juan, has the pandemic impacted funding for street outreach work, and how can funders help?
I mean, I see it as not quite so at the moment, but I see it as, once we get out of this pandemic, if we get out of it, I do see it becoming a challenge. Specifically here in Rhode Island, we know we're going to see potentially some budget cuts. Rhode Island's looking at an $800 million budget cut, and everything is on the table. So we know it's going to have a significant impact to us, definitely in Rhode Island. And we know with budget cuts, that means potentially, less staff and frontline workers and intervention workers on the streets. And we know that can also cause a rise in crime and violence, and then also potentially cause burnout for a lot of staff here in Rhode Island. And so we do see it potentially becoming a problem. I think, I know all of us on the panel collectively know that we see this. It is public health, and public health is public safety. And I know all of us on this panel agree, and we know how essential street outreach work is to our communities when it comes to violence and dealing with high-risk individuals. So one, I think it's a collective of individuals and organizations coming together and standing firm on what we believe, and knowing that we believe in street outreach, and we know this has to be respected work in the communities, especially in the communities of color. Funders, those that already support the organizations that are here on this panel today, I think reaching out to other potential funders and explaining how important this work is and how necessary it is and how essential it is to communities of color and where we do see violence. And so I think it's the funders that are already on board reaching out to other funders and letting them know how important this work is.
Thank you. Next question is from Aileen. Chris Patterson, I'll hand this over to you. Let me see. She asks, how can prosecutors partner in helping to curb gun violence?
Yeah, it's a good question. So here in Chicago, we already have a working relationship with the state's attorney's office here. And some of the ways, or the creative ways we've been able to support or be supported by the prosecutor's office was to advise us of people who are returning home from prison on violent crimes, gun cases, so that we can engage them prior to them being released. And for those who have been released, but may need additional support. And so that's one of the key ways in which we've been partnering. We've also been working with the prosecutor office in segments with those participants who've gotten themselves in trouble, but could be key individuals in helping ongoing conflicts, right? And so being able to leverage that relationship and help people so that they can help the overall cause of safer streets in Chicago. So there's a couple ways, and we appreciate and encourage the partnership.
Thank you. Thank you. Kentrell, this next question is for you. This is from Mario. Are you finding your current funders being flexible in the way, in the type of work that you're doing? And the work needs to be funded to be effective. So are your funders supporting you all in what you're doing there in Oakland?
Yeah, well, we are the funder. We're one of the funders. So we're definitely being creative and thoughtful about how we, are supporting the work that's happening on the ground. But initially, I want to just say something in terms of the reality. I think Brother Juan mentioned this. Kicking off our COVID team was really some funds that came in and that was raised. It was outside funding that came in that became part of a resource that allowed us to kind of employ our ambassadors. And so I think that's going to be the wave of things. And I think it is important. I'll answer this question, but I also want to speak to the question the brother just had. One of the things that we had the blessing to be able to do was meet not only with the district attorney's office, but we also had one of the presiding judges come in and meet, man, and discuss things like the possibility of having specific gun court, for first-time offenders or even repeat offenders, but being able to look at how we service people in a different way, man, and not just ramming people through the same system. So I think there are a number of ways we look at how gun violence can be supported, legally, and how systems can, support the work that's being done on the ground. In terms of us, and in terms of the work that we want to make sure that, we're very conscious of the pitfalls that this pandemic has created, in terms of funding. We all know that, unfortunately, these kind of services sometimes be the first one to go. So we're making sure that, folks on the ground are doing a lot in terms of reaching out to their, constituents and their support network. And I think there's a lot of fundraising going on among CDOs as well. And so as an agency, the Department of Prevention and Oakland Unite, we're going to continue to work hard, man, to investigate creative ways to continue to be supportive of the work, also expand as well.
Thank you, brother. The next question is for George. It's from P. Torres. How has unemployment impacted violence in the community? And the second part is, have COVID-19 impacted peace treaties in the areas you're serving? This is for George.
I'll go ahead first with the second question, the peace treaty part. So COVID has played a part in some of those peace treaties that we've had, just because, over the past couple months, people are just getting more, irritable, and they're out and about, and just the smallest little thing is kicking up a lot of incidents. And so what we've been noticing is that, you can't go nowhere, you can't do nothing. People are just stuck on the block, and, a small incident that we can probably have mediated, 2-3 months ago, has really sparked up quicker these past couple months. As far as the unemployment rate, we know that in Chicago we have gotten hit hard. Me personally, like with close friends and families, I know a lot of people that have lost their jobs, and so it has played a crucial part and a lot of things that's going on in our city and basically in the community. So we've been doing too is in partnership with INVC and their help is being able to go out and provide some of those resources, food and different things to those families and our participants that actually lost, you know, their jobs or don't have the same income coming in that they used to before, right? And so those little small things that you can do give people hope, and it just creates a buy-in for what we're trying to do as a city and street outreach when we're out in the community, you know, talking about the peace treaties and talking about protecting yourselves against COVID, you know, all those things play hand in hand and go together. And so that's where we at with it.
Yes, sir. This next question is for Brother Taco. This is from Tara Campbell. What are the alternatives to summer programming and outreach to address violence spikes given the pandemic?
Well, it seems like we got a head start on what summer might look like, being that, you know, kids were out of school and folks weren't working. So we did, you know, try to be creative as possible with board games and just trying to keep folks engaged in their own community. Not sure how much of an impact that's going to change during the summer. I'll let our next panelist talk a little bit about that as it relates to the city of Los Angeles. But again, we're just going to keep pushing what we've been pushing. You know, again, keeping folks in their own communities. If we can keep them inside, there's a lot of people that want to go to beaches and parks. As things begin to open up, we would have to determine, you know, what programs we can actually implement. So again, it's determined on what's going to be open and how much liberty we can move around, and that'll determine what type of activities we have for the summer. But for the most part, kind of sticking to the script, what we've been doing, and keep checking in with our communities, helping them out, seeing what their needs are, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you. Thank you. This next question is for Chris Patterson. This question comes from Dahlia. How can we do space activation in COVID times? Are there opportunities to do legislative organizing together for the city of Chicago to increase their budget allocated to violence, interruption, and prevention?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I think there is a huge opportunity in front of us now because COVID-19 is impacting communities, which we were already doing street outreach work in. I do think that it's time, and what we've been eager to show is that street outreach is not a one-trick pony. As epidemics and pandemics hit our community, and epidemics have been hitting communities like Austin and West Garfield and Beck of the Yards for generations. We just need legislators to understand that part of the solution already exists. And I know that they're trying to really scramble and just figure out how do they address COVID-19 in a way that's going to, work for everyone. And we just want them to know in communities that we're serving here in Chicago that make up CRED and READY and CP4P that part of the solution to that problem already exists, and that partnership with street outreach work professionals is wanted. And again, we're really grateful for our current mayor's office acknowledging and supporting the work that we're doing already. And just to really, and I do think a lot of state legislators, our Black Caucus here is very supportive, but to really get everybody on board, and I think we can even speak to that around the country.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. This next question is for Juan, from my sister in the struggle, Patricia Witherspoon, also known as Sugar. What support do you give participants and families who lose a loved one, not to violence, but to COVID-19 or something other than that? Juan, what are you all doing to help families mourn their loss at this unprecedented time?
We've been fortunate to not lose have any of our participants lose anybody to COVID-19. But we've had some staff members lose some close friends and things like that to COVID-19. And the same supports outside of victims compensation and things like that. our victims services and victim advocates are willing to provide whatever is necessary. So whatever resources they have at their disposal, they're providing to all people in the community. And we always want to help. You know, being that, you know, with the Nonviolence Institute, we're the only organization that works with intervention, violence intervention and prevention work. We're kind of seen as the go-to people in Rhode Island when it comes to loss of life, unfortunately. And so our victim services, you know, like I said, we've been fortunate to not have a participant lose anybody to COVID, but we would still provide the outreach. We would still make phone calls and connect people to mental health services if need be, but also connecting them to our referrals, our partners that we know that can assist with things like that.
Thank you. I'm going to open this question up to anybody that wants to answer it. Have you had any challenges with remote programming? If so, what are some of the strategies you've developed and or utilizing to increase participant engagement in programming during COVID-19? And I'll open that up for anybody that wants to answer it.
Can I jump on that? I would imagine a couple people might want to talk about that. So initially, when it first started, you know, obviously we wanted to weigh all our options and keep our staff as safe as possible. But I don't know if there's a substitute for being on hand, being visible, being present physically. So, you know, our organization, we have about 90 staff, and about 60 of them have been on the front line. That includes victim service, case management, and outreach staff. And I've been seeing that across the board with other CP4P sites as well, our partners at CRED. I don't think there's a substitute to being hands-on, especially as it concerns addressing people in their worst moments, oftentimes. If you look at there's law enforcement, there's obviously responders at the hospitals, which we appreciate, the fire department, but that's it, right? And if you take street outreach out of that equation, if people are not hands-on touching people, I don't think we get the same result. So I think it's a valuable tool that has to be out there.
Good answer. Anybody else want to answer that question? And that's coming from Ashley Miller from CRED 5000 West.
Yeah, I would like to touch on that. I mean, our employment services have been working diligently around the clock with participants in our CEED program. And so a lot of it's been, I mean, to echo what Chris said, yes, there's nothing like being physically present with our young people. But unfortunately, these times have forced us to be creative. And so we've gone to the virtual world where they're still doing their touch points and having their roots meetings, which is basically a case management meeting. And our employment services have been faced with challenges, but been trying to work through those consistently. Like I said earlier, victim services is still doing their responses and contacting victims and helping them walk through the online victims compensation application process virtually as well. Same thing with our nonviolence training has gone to the internet to actually promote nonviolence to the community at large. And our reentry services, same thing. Still trying to be active out there, still trying to get those touch points in, but it's been very difficult during these times. And you know, our street outreach team, our street workers are still going to the hospitals, right? Still, but that distance that has to be remained between the victim and the street worker is also doesn't allow for that more intimate conversation as opposed to what's going on now. So you're not able to get as much information as you need because you're speaking from a distance and there's other people around. So those are the challenges, but we've tried to go virtual as much as possible.
And Brother Mel, just to chime in and to kind of echo what Chris and Juan have said, I think this has provided an opportunity for us to step back and really figure out the technology piece, right? So a lot of our street outreach workers, they like to be on point right there in your face, right? And at this time, we had to make that adjustment, right? And so being able to utilize some of the technology that we have nowadays and getting them trained and utilizing it, I think it's going to take us to another level, right? So, because there's ways for you to do it hands-on, right in people's face, and then there's also another way we can do it as we're doing, you know, right now on these calls. You're using Zoom. There's so many different platforms out there that, you know, the young people are using. And so our outreach team, you know, across the city is a little older in Chicago, right? And so we've had a barrier with technology, right? When we first started doing this, you were like, hey, you know, we're gonna send you this link, just click it. And it's like something totally, you know, new to them. They're like, whoa, I'm scared to even do this. So being able to do this for the last couple months, I think has made our unit across the city a lot stronger, because we're able to connect in different ways that we haven't been able to connect before. So just wanted to share that.
Good one. Good one. I want to open this question up to the panel, but I want Kentrell to answer this first. This is from Brother Chico Tillman up out of Chicago. What precautions are you putting in place for the new norm of potential shooters wearing masks in public? And is it possible for the gun violence epidemic to receive the same type of support as the COVID pandemic? Kentrell, I'll start with you, and then anybody else can answer that on the panel.
Excellent question. I think some of the things that our ambassadors are doing as they're in communities is actually having that conversation, you know, because there's a difference between folks, you know, protecting themselves from, you know, potential virus, but then also weeding out those who are using this, you know, opportunity to cover their face to take advantage of, you know, crime and violence. And so I think what's happening indirectly is these are separating themselves. You know, folks, as we jump out and in these communities, we lead with this thought of safety first. You know, and I think that reality of it is like whether you want to approach it from health, whether you want to approach it from gun violence, the matter is safety first. You know, so I think a lot of these guys, you know, are seeing people from their own hood jumping out with masks, with gloves, with hand sanitizer, having conversations, but I think it leads to a larger conversation about behavioral change, which is a real issue. And I think the more communities are engaged in these levels of conversation, I think that won't be able to hide. And I think it does have to have a lot of attention on gun violence as we put on this pandemic. It has to be an emergency response to what's happening across the nation with gun violence.
Thank you. Anybody else want to briefly answer that question?
I mean, I find it's kind of, you know, ironic that we've certain communities we've done outreach. We see young guys hanging on the street corners, you know, with masks on, and really trying to. I think they're really trying to protect themselves from COVID-19, but they're still hanging in hotspot areas that they're not protecting themselves from gunshots. Right, so it's like you're willing to wear this mask because you're afraid of catching this virus, but you're not willing to stay off the street corner knowing that you're a target. And so, you know, that's the challenge we're facing. Also, if we're talking about these, you know, housing projects and things like that, where they can't practice social distance just because we know that, you know, there's 4 or 5 people living in an apartment, right, a small apartment, and then they're on top of each other. And so they're not allowed, you know, they're not privileged or they don't have the ability to practice social distancing. But you see these guys out here with the mask on and they're walking around their neighborhoods, but they're not being conscious of you still can be shot today, even though you're trying to protect yourself from COVID. So I find that, you know, ironic.
Yes, sir. The last question is from Heidi Moon. And this is an important one. And this is for anybody. I just want to do the time check. We'll be shutting this part of the panel down in a couple of minutes, so please be brief. Are there specific roles that women staff can play, especially during the pandemic? And if so, could you talk about that? Does anybody want to briefly touch on that? Brother Chris, you want to hit on that?
I do. Thank you. So historically, you know, organizations like the Institute for Nonviolence and across the country, we haven't done a good job at engaging the young women who are drivers of violence. We've done an equally poor job as giving opportunities to the women in the community who could be peace ambassadors. And from my experience with the intention, but to know better is to do better. And with our organization, we have many women on the team who have all the lived life experiences that men have. In fact, though, as it pertains to street outreach work, there's a bond that happens with some of the women who do street outreach that the men just can't penetrate. And I think that we need to, and you need to leverage that resource, right? And we need to be really conscious and strategic about actually, living by the principles in which we say we stand by, get equality. We want, we often talk about equality for everyone else, and we sometimes don't think about it, on our doorsteps, right? And so there are women who are leading the city. We have Susan Lee, we have the mayor. Like, come on, like we know what what our women bring to the field, and I think that if we're going to be good stewards, we're going to be good partners and allies. We need to be real with ourselves and kind of get out of our own way to help our communities.
Absolutely. I just want to shout out all of the women in violence reduction doing a phenomenal job on the front line, leading teams, leading organizations. This work wouldn't be successful without you all. So I definitely want to send that shout out. I also want to shout out everybody that's here, that's listening, that's participating, that ask questions. And I definitely want to send my love and appreciation to all of the panelists. This work that you all are doing, not everybody's not able to stand in the gap and do what you all are doing. So I thank you all for the phenomenal work. And I pray that you and your families are doing well during this time. At this time, I'd like to, shift gears. We're now going to move towards the second part of the panel. Let's bring Fernando back on to moderate this session as we hear from city leaders. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, Mel. Thank you, the panelists. Great job. Always good to hear from folks that are closest to the ground, or some people say closest to the pain, that are addressing the violence on the streets. So now we're going to transition to the second hour and hear from city leaders who are responsible for implementing violence reduction strategies at the city level. So we're honored to have 3 seasoned panelists from Chicago, LA, and Oakland. And we asked them to respond to 4 questions. So each of them are going to have about 8 to 9 minutes to respond to these 4 questions. So we asked them to briefly introduce themselves and their role at the office. And then the first question is, has your city classified outreach workers as essential? And if so, why or why not? How have outreach and intervention workers in your city expanded their work to address violence and the COVID pandemic? And then what are the biggest challenges and needs in the community during this time? And what does the future of violence reduction work look like as we move to a new normal? So with that, we're happy to have our 3 panelists. And so we're going to start with the LA Mayor's Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development, Director Ann Tremblay.
Good morning, everyone. Just to clarify, Fernando, I think I may have missed it in the instructions. We're doing this one at a time. We're doing these questions at a time. I'm not clear if you want me to do all these questions at once, or what's the process here? Can you hear me?
Sorry, just all at once.
All at once. All of that all at once? Oh my goodness. Okay. All righty. Well then, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the National Street Outreach Partnership for including me. Obviously, I'm here representing a large group of people, both our team here in the GRID office, as well as our 25 community-based organizations that we fund to do gang prevention and intervention throughout the city of Los Angeles. For those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with LA, it's kind of important to ground it a little bit. Our work, we have a large geographic reach because our city is nearly 500 square miles. And our focus in this work is on 23 communities, 23 neighborhoods with the highest incidence of gang violence, as well as high levels of poverty, unemployment, disconnected youth, all the factors that prevent folks from having the opportunities they need and for really thriving in our city. And so those are our areas of focus. We have 4 components to our work: community engagement, gang prevention, gang intervention, and violence interruption. And undergirding that work is a strong training and technical assistance component for our agencies, as well as a robust data research and evaluation component. We have a robust data infrastructure that we use to track the work and to learn from it. We really rely on data to help us inform the practice and support the work of the practitioners in real time as much as possible, through data feedback loops and through research briefs and really integrated work with our data research and evaluation team. Our city has classified the work that we do as essential and the workers as essential. So as Fernando mentioned at the beginning, in terms of people, our emergency, our gang and crisis intervention workers have been deemed emergency workers, and as well as anybody performing work to provide essential services. So that's the people. The business activities include social service agencies, and specifically named among social service agencies in the mayor's Safer at Home order were prevention and intervention providers, domestic violence, and homeless service providers. So there's no question that the order reflected what we all know, that this work isn't in fact essential, and the practitioners of this work are absolutely essential to our city when it comes to violence prevention. And as you heard earlier, right, it also, this emergency has certainly reinforced that, but also shown the tremendous value that, I think it was Chris who said, intervention is not a one-trick pony. And I think it was him who had a horse behind him when he said that. But they're absolutely the case. They're not a one-trick pony. Can do a lot more and have done. So with the pandemic, what our teams have done on both the prevention and intervention side, but I'll focus on our intervention side, they've continued to do the work they do every day. Continue to respond to shootings and homicides, continue to do proactive peacemaking, continue to try to prevent retaliatory violence and do rumor control. And they've taken those same skills and applied it to the pandemic. They have done rumor control around public health issues, around the virus, how you can get it, how it's transmitted. They have done rumor control around the Safer at Home orders, so folks know what's going on. As Ben mentioned, Taco mentioned, right? We've got a lot of layers of government here, and different orders have happened at different times, with sometimes our city, our mayor leading the way before the state or the county had. So that presented some challenges, and our intervention teams rose to those challenges. So they've really become public health workers, in fact, even if not in name, on both those fronts, about the orders that are existing as well as the virus itself. They've also continued to provide case management services to youth and families, just as they do in regular circumstances. They've adjusted with using technology, including Zoom workshops and other technology to get them through that. And they have just risen to the occasion in every way possible. One great example is we have our family source centers here in the city. Through philanthropy, we're providing both grocery cards, and then later actually MasterCard credit cards to families who met certain criteria to get cash in their pocket. And our intervention agencies played a crucial role in supporting how those were distributed, in helping have that done, have that operation be completed safely and in a supportive way. So they were able to partner effectively with other community-based organizations that were doing that work. And once again, stepped up like they always do to keep the community safe, the community informed, and to be supportive of families in need, regardless of whether they were families that were receiving services from their particular particular agency. Lots of challenges during this. I think resources is the challenge. Resources like PPE initially, face coverings, resources to support our practitioners for them to keep them safe, to help keep their families safe, to help keep their mental health and their sanity as they try to support their families and do homeschooling while also do their community-based work. And then resources to just adequately move beyond this is going to be a real challenge in light of the budget issues mentioned. We certainly have those here. And looking at how what we know, also mentioned, is that this emergency disproportionately impacts communities of color. It disproportionately impacts the communities that we serve in the mayor's CRED office and with our partners, both on the virus front as well as the economic fallout from this emergency. So getting as creative as we can, trying to maintain those city funds and then find the philanthropic partners to help us continue this work. And I am not sure what new normal is or what it's going to be, but I know together we're going to be as creative as possible to get us through it, because we've seen how creative, resilient, and how our prevention and intervention providers can rise to any challenge. And I think one of the biggest will be what is this summer going to look like for us? Our marquee program, which my colleague who's also participating in this call, Guillermo Cespedes, who used to both created our summer program, helped create that program, the Summer Nightlights program, when he was in my position of overseeing this work here in Los Angeles, is how are we going to keep folks engaged, keep our agencies well connected to the community in terms of violence prevention when we don't have the parks as a focal point where we can do full-on programming, have hundreds of people in the park with free food, free activities, free sports, all of the things that we do at 32 parks every year. So what we're looking ahead to is a modified program, because we're not going to be able to do it in the same way in light of the social distancing restrictions. So we're getting creative, and just like I think we'll have to do all of next year, is be creative, innovative, and work closely to meet this really unprecedented moment in our work.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for sharing a little bit about what's going on in LA, and thank you for your leadership at this time. I know it's a crazy time in the city. With that, we're going to move on to Susan Lee. She is the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety and oversees the Chicago's Office of Violence Reduction.
So good afternoon. It feels like coming home on this webinar. There's a lot of folks on the list of participants and obviously on the panel that I've known for decades. And so it's great to share this moment and information with you. I am the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety. So as the Deputy Mayor, I oversee the Chicago Police Department, Chicago Fire Department, Office of Emergency and Communication, Emergency Management and Communication, the Police Board, the Citizens Oversight for Police Accountability, COPA, as well as the Office of Violence Reduction. Just a little bit of history on the mayor's office in Chicago. In the last administration, we had 2.5 people working on public safety for the entire city. At And so you can imagine the challenge that that might pose. Currently, I have 9 people in my office, which is obviously a exponential growth in the number of people working on public safety. But my Office of Violence Reduction is probably half or a third of the size of what Anne operates as CRED office and Mayor Garcetti's office. And so at the same time, we have a tremendous violence problem in the city of Chicago, and a super entrenched mistrust between police and communities that has been growing for decades. And so, and our police department is under a consent decree. So that sort of creates the backdrop for the work that I am doing on behalf of Mayor Lightfoot. And I think for the many years that street outreach has been a part of Chicago's landscape, and actually for decades, really. The one thing that we had an issue in Chicago is what we call funding trauma, because there was never ever a very steady stream of sustainable funding that went to street outreach, nor an attempt at trying to build a citywide system and standards of practice around street outreach. And so with this, under Mayor Lightfoot's leadership, we are walking in that direction. And as COVID hit, we were just about to release city's really first investment into street outreach as a citywide strategy that augments years of support from philanthropy, some of whom I think are on this call, that have sustained the practice of violence interruption, rumor control, all of the peacemaking, proactive peacemaking that we know are essential in our communities that are most impacted by violence. And so, fortunately or unfortunately, we were in that process of releasing the city dollars for to embrace street outreach as well as trauma-informed victim services as part of a comprehensive violence reduction strategy as COVID was hitting. And so we felt that it was only logical that street outreach workers, as well as victim service providers, along with other health and human social service providers, would be deemed essential. And so they have been deemed essential in the city of Chicago. And that has meant our ability to support them both with PPE support, as well as other public health, public education materials, as well as other sorts of connections to food distribution, food depositories and whatnot, that allows the outreach workers to be effective in the communities that they're working in. And they are serving both that public safety and public health role right now. And as Chris mentioned, I think, or Jorge, they are really the only ones out there aside from the first responders. Everybody else has shut down, even some of the health and social service providers. And so really outreach, gang intervention, as you know it in LA, victim advocates are really the only ones out there. And they are doing the work of not just violence reduction, which has been their main mission, but really reaching those folks who have not been connected to the system. And as we know, as Anne mentioned, the virus, as well as the violence, hits our communities of color the hardest. And when in Chicago, we recognize this, the mayor formed the Racial Equity Rapid Response Team, which was charged with reaching those communities disproportionately impacted by violence. And even there, I think what we found was that the street outreach and victim service workers had a special ability to reach, even within those communities, folks who were hard to reach, and so in a culturally competent way. And so we developed lots of public education materials, as well as providing PPE to be able to do that work well. I think sometimes we you know, we're looking at some of the federal funding coming down in the CARES Act, and you know what COVID related expenses that we might be able to look at. And one of the things that I think we have to account for is not only that outreach workers are serving this dual function of public health educators and spreading the right message about COVID as well as violence reduction, but in their work as violence reduction workforce, that they are also helping to decompress the healthcare system by reducing the number of shootings and homicides. Unfortunately, Chicago is not experiencing a decline in shootings and homicide, and so the message hits home really closely, especially over this Memorial Day weekend, where we've had the worst Memorial Day weekend since 2015. To say that the outreach workers are essential is kind of an understatement in my mind. I think some of the challenges that I see in the communities that we all work in are the challenges that we have faced for decades, right? It's the lack of hope, the lack of trust, and that results in misinformation sometimes. You know, there were lots of rumors that African Americans could not get COVID for a little bit, that was the rumor out there, that somehow the disease had been created to attack African American communities only, was sort of the flip side of that. So I think getting the right information out in a way that those who are exposed and at risk of violence and their families can accept, because they're coming from credible messengers, is one of the greatest contributions that I think the outreach has been able to do. But the lack of hope and the lack of trust continues. I mean, this is not an issue we're going to solve right now in a minute. It took decades to evolve, and it's going to take decades of effort to, I think, dispel. And we're finding the challenge of the rising trend of violence that we, particularly in Chicago, we really think this summer might be quite challenging for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that many people have been sheltering in place for weeks now, and social media has been heating up with some street group tensions, and folks go out and shoot and are wreaking havoc, while large groups are now gathering as the city is opening up. And so all of those things we think may lead to a perfect storm. And so evermore, we are working on trying to make sure that outreach workers are able to do their work. I know Mel mentioned flip workers, who are sort of the ambassador-like folks who are closest to the ground. They have always also been declared essential in Chicago. So we hope between more strategic policing and robust outreach presence and the help of the flip workers that we're gonna have a positive impact on violence is all of our collective hope. Having said that, we are operating what we're calling an emergency summer operations center every weekend in Chicago for the first time, which allows us to mobilize all of city's resources, not just police or fire, but also streets and sanitation, Department of Building, Department of Transportation, to try to create a bigger footprint of a city's visibility out there in the communities where violence tends to escalate during summer, but also do this crucial coordination with street outreach and other community-based interventions so that we can get ahead of some of the violence trends. Really quickly, I think the future is, as Ann said, there are some immediate future challenges because we don't have the public spaces that are open. We don't want folks gathering in large numbers out there because of the transmission risks. I think the longer term issues for the field of street outreach particularly are, we're seeing the vulnerability of the workforce. Some of the outreach workers or gang intervention workers tend to be older, have underlying health issues. And so I think there is a need to protect those workers and leaders, while trying to really bring in a new generation of workers and folks who can learn from the elders and strengthen the field overall, I think is a challenge for the outreach profession. I think secondarily, there's kind of an opportunity as well as a challenge. I think because in so many cities, outreach has been deemed essential and also performing and demonstrating really in this very crucial way their ability to reach a hard to reach population for very critical public health and public safety reasons. My hope is that we figure out a systematic solution to create sustainability for this field, whether that is becoming community health, or designated as community health workers, part of the healthcare system, whatever that iteration may look like. I think it behooves those folks on this call to really think about what does that sustainability process and system look like down as we move forward, given the enormous contribution that outreach and gang intervention workforce has made during this pandemic and crisis. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for your commitment to Chicago and to supporting street outreach nationally. We're going to move to the next speaker. I'd like to welcome Guillermo Cespedes. He's the Chief of Violence Prevention from Oakland's Department of Violence Prevention.
Thank you, Fernando. My name is Guillermo Cespedes, and my current title is Chief of Violence Prevention, which I think reflects a little bit of Oakland's progressive thinking around violence prevention. When Oakland established the legislation for the Department of Violence Prevention in 2017, they chose to establish a position of a Chief of Violence Prevention so that it would be at the same level of authority as the Chief of Police. Oakland has, like both of the cities that where Ann works and where Susan works, some historic issues around communities of color and relationships with police, in particular, the African-American community. Over the last decade in Oakland, 70% of homicide victims in Oakland have been African-Americans. Only 40% of cases of African Americans over the last decade have led to an arrest versus 80% of white cases. The city has had a real issue with police chiefs. It's of course under a consent decree as well. And there are a lot of, the situation is improving, but the city's having has a history of real tensions. It is a small city, very small in comparison to LA and Chicago. The geography is, the population is around 400,000, but the homicide rate is about 17.5 per 100,000 residents. That means that every homicide is felt throughout the city. When I worked in LA it's almost like a state rather than in comparison. So Oakland is very unique in that way. Yes, violence interrupters have been declared outreach workers. All of the folks working in violence prevention and intervention have been declared essential by the city at the beginning of the pandemic. Oakland has moved away from using outreach workers and has created a workforce called community healers. They do essentially similar work as outreach workers, except some of the work is related to establishing community healing events. The expanded role, I think, with the title of essential workers, I think came a certain element of pride across the country because historically, many of us have been advocating for many years precisely for that definition, to declare violence interruption or gang intervention work as essential. I do see some problems with that because I think the definition of essential didn't come with some of the other resources that essential workers require. So it meant that the role got expanded. Now, Oakland interrupters are doing both interruption work and public health work. So yes, the role has been expanded. They've been doing an amazing job, both in preventing violence or interrupting violence and interrupting COVID. In Oakland, like in Chicago, like in LA, the communities with the highest rates of infection have been communities that also have had high rates of violence over the years. So it is not a new problem necessarily. COVID did not create the underlying conditions that have led to violence. It's exposed them, to look at it that way. So as we expanded the role of the workforce, around the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, shootings were way down, and Oakland has a very active community advocacy network that took to the neighborhoods and provided PPE and food, etc. The Department of Violence Prevention during the first 2 weeks, our role was primarily to be the supplier of the resources that were being brought into the community by community groups. The operational budget of the Department of Violence Prevention really did not at that point permit just pivoting and sending everyone into the field. Consequently, the mayor of Oakland generated some funding from the private sector for us to put together an outreach strategy, very much building the plane as we were flying it, because no one really knew the course of, and we still don't, of the pandemic. Roughly 4 weeks into the effort, I think I started to see some things that were new to me, which were, one, the level of risk that interrupters were going into was very high. And yes, interrupters have historically gone into the line of fire. However, this is a little bit different because you don't know where the bullets are coming from. You don't know what neighborhoods are retaliating. You don't have the intel that you generally use to figure out what to mediate. This is something that puts their lives in danger, but it's somewhat unpredictable. Especially in the early phases, we had no idea how people get contaminated, how it gets passed on, etc. Some of the challenges that have been discovered or encountered, I think are the challenges of long-term conditions that now have been exacerbated. So, the interrupters are now doing violence interruption, public health work, employment counseling. They're delivering food. They're helping families deal with some of the internal fighting that takes place when families are locked up. So it's been a bit of, from my conversations and reports that I get back, I think it's been a little bit alarming that interrupters are now going into neighborhoods and in essence are being asked to provide a much wider range of services that they don't really have enough resources in their toolbox. So there's a sense of what is called license to operate in LA, or neighborhood credibility. There's a sense that people's credibilities are a little bit on the line because they're being asked, the community is asking them to solve things that they really don't have the resources to solve. Because these are communities that we have ignored for many years. We just have not been present, and government systems really lack credibility in these communities. moving forward, I do think that the profession is in a really critically important point of figuring out how much to adopt the public health mantle while keeping the same identity as a profession that specializes in interrupting violence. I don't know whether that means additional training. I'm not sure. I do think that we are at a really interesting crossroads for the profession, and I think it's very exciting that we're having these conversations, because I do see this as an opportunity for a field that many of us have defended for many years. I do think that in defending that field, I think we have to keep in mind that it's not just about recognition. I think it's safe to say that across the country, violence interruption, gang intervention work is respected work. It is my hope that that translates into a different kind of salary structure and benefits and those kinds of things. Like Ann mentioned and Susan mentioned, we are also heading towards a really concerning summer, and very familiar with the Summer Night Lights efforts in LA. So we will be looking at what elements of that can be implemented that can be blended with social distancing. So the activities may look very different. How much creativity can go into creating Summer Night Lights type events that adhere to social distancing. I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. We are experiencing, while the first 2 weeks in Oakland, 3 weeks in Oakland, there was a drop in shootings, that has spiked back up. We're not at the level that we were in 2018 and 19, but it is spiking. And we're seeing more regional action between groups. And we're seeing a little bit more of activity among Latino gangs. So all of that to say that we share some of the concern that Susan and Ann have around what's going to take place during the summer. Great to be here, great to hear the work that is being done. It's very inspiring. We're very excited to be a part of this, this network and contributing whatever way we can. Oakland is both in a position to, there is some amazing work being done here. And at the same time, we also are very aware that there's a lot of learning that can take place from the work being done in Chicago and LA. So thank you for having us, and I look forward to some of the questions.
Great, thank you, Guillermo, and thank you for your work in Oakland. So I'm going to ask the three panelists if you can put your videos on so that we can move to the Q&A section. So I wanted to give Ann an opportunity, because Susan touched on it, Guillermo touched on it, but maybe to talk a little bit about what the summer looks like, summer strategy is looking like right now, if you'd like to share that, Ann. I know someone asked about it during the last panel as well.
Yes, so we're sort of in the midst of it all. So it's challenging what I can say at this moment, right? Summer Night Lights for us is a public-private partnership. So we're still looking to see on the private side what's going to come through. Some of our funders are large corporations as well as philanthropy, and many of them pivoted to fund COVID-19 related projects over the last couple months. So seeing what of those funds, like how much do we actually need versus what we would normally need, and then who is still going to be able to support it. On the public side, we're presented with the challenge that there's a hard hiring freeze in the city. So even if there were programming, our typical summer youth hiring through Summer Night Lights is a challenge at the moment. But we also know that there's going to be very little in-person activities that we would typically do in light of the safer at home orders that are in place. And even as we're moving through those phases here, as our governor in California has set out, and our County Board of Supervisors and Mayor Garcetti are working to move us through those phases and continue to open things up, we don't see a horizon where we can have 400 or 500 people in a park doing all the activities I talked about before, sharing in food and having youth cooking food, having the sports activities and the cultural activities that go on. Many of our parks literally do have hundreds of people in them. Sometimes the busy ones, as many as 600 people in that park. That's not going to happen this summer. It can't happen. So what does it look like that we still get connected? What of this can we do to engage communities and certainly engage young people online the way our agencies already have been doing over these last couple months through some of the regular pieces that we do? Can we do that through Instagram Live, Facebook Live, et cetera? And then can we also have some community events to get folks some of the things they need, like meals, like activity kits for the kids, like other resources, making sure that folks have the materials and wherewithal to access CARES Act funding, especially for those that maybe don't file taxes typically, so wouldn't have gotten an automatic check into their account. There's certainly lots of folks that would be eligible for funding if they weren't filing a tax return, but they're still eligible. Doing all those kinds of things to keep the community engaged and connected, while also focusing on the proactive peacemaking, so that since violence in the summer does traditionally rise here in Los Angeles, how can we keep that going in a strong way when we don't have the park and all the folks in the park as a focal point? And we're being creative, innovative, and we're going to have to bring together all of our agencies, all of our public-private partners, and do something unprecedented, and to do that probably with some quite limited funds. But we're going to do it because it's what we do. We've got a lot. We do have, with the length of time here, although we serve communities that, as Guillermo pointed out, like so many cities, have a long history of distrust. We have over the years built some better relationships. So we'll have LAPD engaged with us on that. The chief of police was one of the first people and one of the loudest voices to ensure that our intervention workers were classified as emergency workers and that this was essential business. I didn't have to push for that. It was a given because he asked for it, just as I did from the get-go. So I think we still have those struggles here, no doubt, and that long history, but we're able to, we have gotten to the point where we have some stronger relationships, and we'll bring those to bear in some honest conversations about what the summer can look like. So.
Thank you, Ann. Definitely time to be creative, particularly in the summer. So the first question that we received, I'll give this one to Susan. A question from Chicago schools stating they're extremely worried about students and social media right now with everything that's going on. Georgia, New York, Minneapolis. How are street workers engaging online?
Well, I think that's been a big part of the training, both in Chicago and LA, and I think in Oakland as well, of the outreach and violence interrupters, gang intervention, community healers, whatever we're calling them. I think the understanding that social media interaction is a big part of how violence is escalating and then turns into physical violence in the community has been there for a long time. And so I think most outreach organizations, gang intervention organizations, have some capacity to monitor social media. I think one of the things that we're doing in Chicago is Chicago PD has a social media team, and they are generating potential lists of parties and conflicts and locations where that might be happening, and they are now willing to share that with outreach in case outreach is able to impact those dynamics in some positive way. And so that flow of information, I think it's been going on in other places for a while, but it's certainly a new thing in Chicago. I think that Chicago CRED has been really essential in creating a positive social media platform using influencers and some rap artists who can send forth positive peacemaking messages out, as well as music out to their constituents in order to promote the idea that we should not be engaging in random acts of violence, and that we should not be shooting into the crowd, and we should think about promoting peace in the community. And that I think is a proactive stance around using social media to build peace. And so I think we're trying to do both things. One is monitoring social media for potential conflicts, as well as large group gatherings that can then turn into targets for drive-by shootings, which has happened multiple times over the weekend, actually, as well as trying to put forth more positive messages out to through this social media platform.
Thank you, Susan. The next question I'll give to Guillermo. This is coming from Emily Dugdale from KPCC in LA, part of the NPR. Can city leaders discuss the challenge and expected costs of providing PPE to street outreach workers for the foreseeable future?
I'm sorry, Fernanda, do you repeat the question?
So, can city leaders discuss the challenges and expected costs of providing PPE to street outreach workers for the foreseeable future?
Well, in our case, we've been in contact with some of the suppliers in LA, because the main issue is the flow of the availability of PPE. There is, and of course, my concern is that PPE is not the outcome. PPE is the process for violence interruption to reduce violence. So it is about getting people to put on a mask, but it's to get a particular audience to put on a mask. So in other words, there's a danger right now in just counting the number of masks or the number of food bags or that kind of thing, which at least here there is. I'm not suggesting that's the case nationally, but so yes, I think that is a huge issue, because PPE has become a certain, almost like currency. And so like other cities, we have a problem with the supply and the demand. At this point, we're actually buying PPE supplies from other cities because our own flow of supplies has been depleted a little bit. So yes, that will continue for how long? We don't know, because we don't know we're talking about really establishing a different cultural norm in communities that, at some point we have to question, is there a more culturally congruent way of slowing down the virus than what we've come up with? Because, social distancing and telecommuting, to some degree, it's a little bit culturally biased. If you live with 5 people in a 3-room apartment, it's going to be very difficult to social distance. If you're living in a highly dense community, it's going to be very difficult to social distance. Never mind telecommuting. I live in East Oakland, in the zip code with the highest rate of infection, certainly in Alameda County, which is like 463 cases per 100,000 residents. That's huge. And we're not really impacting behavior as much as we would like. And part of it doesn't have to do with people not wanting to adhere. Part of it has to do with the conditions that don't permit people to do it. So PPE is an issue, and more than that is, can we use PPE to actually engage in behavior change that is possible within these communities? there's an community advocate here that tells me that social distancing is a privilege. And to some degree, that there's some truth to that. If you live in a housing development in a small apartment with, so PPE, yes, the supply is important, but we have to make sure that, you know, the supply is tied to the outcome that we're looking to establish.
Thank you, Guillermo.
Sure.
So this question comes from Coach Cornell Ward in Los Angeles, part of Chapter 2. So he says, for all panelists, due to another Black man killed by police officers, he's talking about Minnesota, Minneapolis.
Yeah.
What do you think we can do to stay proactive on a national level to help our hurting communities come together without having civil unrest? We need answers. Thank you. So anyone care to address that?
Well, I think Ann mentioned something about LA that I think is really important for all of us to remember, that cities can get to a point where the relationship between law enforcement and community can be improved. I think LA is a good example of one of the examples of what it took to turn that to the level that it is now. And everyone on this panel took a part in getting LAPD to a different point. That improvement is also being seen in Oakland recently. The issue between, you know, law enforcement and Black communities is just, it's so deeply rooted. I'd say even a little bit more so than with Spanish-speaking communities. It's so deeply rooted in the history of just structural racism of the country that it's constant work. And I think it's work that some people don't like the analogy I use, that I think the work between social programs and law enforcement is like a long-term marriage. You have to keep working on it day in and day out, and you can't put it on automatic pilot. So these incidents of violence not only hurts the families that have gotten victimized by it, but it really hurts the work that we're trying to do. So, because it sets us back. So it's very discouraging, very, very discouraging. It is not only traumatizing for those communities, but for the entire country. Those videos have been just unbearable to watch. Anyway, I'll give my colleagues a chance to weigh in on this. There is hope, which is, I think, what LA is telling us, but it's a long-term work. It's not, I generally divide this work into putting out fires and fireproofing. Working with law enforcement and changing those cultural perceptions of communities of color is fireproofing, and that's long-term work.
Thank you, Guillermo.
So I would just add to that, you know, as you all know, I think that Charlie Beck was in Chicago as the interim superintendent for 5 months, and it brought a lot of stability and a very kind of candid and upfront approach with the communities, which I think the communities were a little bit taken aback by, given the history of Chicago, and especially on the south and the west side. And like Guillermo said, those videos are hard to watch because they, one, that it happened, but two, it just happens too many times and too often. From my positioning, I get lots of viral videos of CPD police officers interacting in an inappropriate way with the community. And sometimes there's no context, so only that moment is captured. I don't know what happened before and after all of that. But, you know, even, I just want to mention that, you know, police also have a really, really tough job, right? And so one of the things that is happening is they're being asked to enforce the public health order to disperse large crowds because of the danger of transmission of COVID and whatnot. And given the structural racism that Guillermo talked about and the history of deep-seated inequity in Chicago, with the losing end being really on the south and the west side with the Black and brown communities, I question, like, are is CPD enforcing those public health orders in the same way in the African American communities as they are doing it in citywide? And I know that they are, but the perception is that it's part and parcel of this narrative of inequitable and unfair, procedurally unjust ways in which police have interacted with community. And so it's another vector that makes both the peace building and the public health crisis super difficult and challenging. And it does speak to the idea that if we can get to a little bit to where LA has gotten to in terms of an improvement, not perfect, but improvement in police community relations, that I think both of those fronts would benefit, right? It's both the public safety and kind of the health crisis would benefit, because we would go from a place of trust. So it is vexing for sure.
Thank you for that. We'll just move on. We have about 7 minutes left, and so if we can just answer some of these briefly. But this is a great question, I think, for everyone. If everyone could just touch on it briefly. If you could have one wish fulfilled right now to assist your city in your work, what would that be? And that comes from Michelle Novello or Novello. One wish. I see a lot of smiles.
Well, I'm just going to make it easy. Money, 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 money. I think we have there. I know you said make it short. We've got a lot of great things in place, but with more funding, we can do more, deeper, better, get more folks into this work, develop, train them, look to that future, that post-pandemic future and strength of this work with more funding, both public and private. And money is not always the answer to every problem, but I don't say that lightly. But with this work, I think we can do more. Even in a city like ours that is well funded in this work, that has developed to a $25 million plus in public funds every year. And I know other cities get upset when I say that. We've grown to that, but we could still use more, because there's deeper, farther we can go, especially after this pandemic, in this work, and to help folks get those cost of living increases, additional benefits, and have those organizations have security and funding over the long term, so that they can have be visionary in the work rather than competing for scarce dollars.
I would say money, everything Ann said, besides money, and structural change. The money in Oakland, the $9 million plus dollars that comes to our department, it's actually through a ballot measure. So the citizens actually pay for it through their taxes, parking, property taxes, etc. So I would say more money, and at the same time, structural changes, both about where the money comes from and just how city government goes about doing the business of violence prevention. I'm still not sure what the best platform for a city to use. Departments are, we always complain that we're a little bit slow to be able to get money out the door. Departments, city government cannot always react as quickly as a crisis is happening. So I would say money and changing some of the rules that allow city government to get money out the door. But that's a good dream to have. I want to sleep better today.
That's right. Susan.
Definitely money, particularly because, all the cities are going to have some major gaps as a result of the COVID. And each of us, I think the three of us, are in an unenviable position of having to defend what is there. But I guess in addition to money, I wish the outreach gang intervention communities throughout these cities would come together and be more cohesive. I think in Chicago, we're still facing a little bit of divisive politics. like I'm better than you are, or you're better than, you know, he is, and I'm more legitimate because I am this and you're not, and, you know, all of those politics around money. And so I do think, and maybe I'm just being idealistic, but I think that if we were more cohesive and stood together as a community of practitioners, we would have a way better chance of building sustainability and keeping it. And so, yes, money, but I struggle with the way the money politics play out. And it just is, it's a waste of time, because I think that the powers that be, where the money is being drawn from, just need to hear from us as a united community. So.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. Well said. This one, so we have about 2 minutes left. So just a brief answer, and I'll send this one to Susan. Is violence prevention formally considered public health?
Well, it's clear, right? I mean, just from the one thing that I did, I got interviewed by Chicago Tribune the other day, and I sort of said, you know, for somebody as really focused on violence reduction as I am, you know, it's been really hard to make that argument about public health aspect of it until COVID hit. And so when we were faced with this pandemic and a global crisis around health, I think people started connecting the dots, right? That yes, the same reasons why COVID is hitting South and the West Side harder is the same reason why we've had decades of violence, and the same reason why we have poor performing schools, and oh my God, like these things are all true. So yes, I mean, I think more than ever, and that's why I think as terrible as the pandemic has been, there is a sliver of moment of opportunity here for those of us working on violence reduction, because I think the things that we see as the entrenched sources of issues are part of the same ecosystem of problems that we are all trying to address. And we need to, that's why I keep saying we need to stand together to do it, because it was such a hard argument before COVID. It's going to be maybe slightly easier, but it's still going to be a hard argument after COVID.
Thank you. Maybe Guillermo and Anne, if you want 30 seconds to just briefly comment on that.
This format is one of those ways of bringing the community together. That's my 30 seconds, and we just have to keep at it.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll just echo what Susan said. Absolutely. And I just want to really quickly go to a question that happened before, that came up before. What we're doing on the data front is updating our data system to document all the work that's been done that's COVID related, because from a government perspective, having that documented, just like we do with all of the work on a regular basis, is a powerful tool in terms of getting the work, the appreciation, and those important dollars going forward.
Thank you, Anne. So thank you to Guillermo, Anne, and Susan for participating. So the last 2 hours, we talked to about 9 panelists that are leaders in this field nationally that are pushing this forward. So not only coming together nationally, but also working directly at the neighborhood level, at the city level, you know, with county, and doing some statewide advocacy as well to push this field forward. And I'm grateful to everybody for the work that's being done. And the fact that we can come together and have these conversations on a national level, I think takes it to a different level, you know, with the focus being on practitioners and practitioners' voice and helping to guide and lead a lot of this. So I want to really thank you and appreciate you for all your leadership throughout the years, helping to build this field and make it survive, make it sustainable in the cities, and working with communities that need it the most. So big thank you to everybody who joined on the web panel, but also the participants, the attendees, for the thoughtful questions. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to email us. A survey should pop up when you log off. So if you have a moment, please provide us some feedback. Thank you again. Stay safe and healthy. Peace.
Thank you.
Peace.